But most importantly, I think a generation of Aboriginal people were realising they had rights which they could enforce, and they had a source to go to help them do it. Peter Hidden's my name. I'm now Justice of the Supreme Court. I was then a solicitor, a very young solicitor. I worked at the ALS from June 72 to February 74, and then I went to the bar. Right. Having gone to the bar, I did continue to do a lot of ALS work as a barrister, so I kept the contact up. I was actually rung by Hal Wooten. I was a young solicitor at the Public Solicitor's Office, and I don't quite know why Hal rang me, to be honest, to ask whether I'd be interested in a position at the ALS. I really had no idea about it. I knew nothing about it. And typically of my generation of whites, I suppose, I lived in the eastern suburbs, about 5 kilometres from Redfern, and had no idea there was an Aboriginal population there. So I met a few Aboriginal people, having been interviewed. We had a drink at the Empress Hotel, and I was offered the job. I'd come from the Public Solicitor's Office, which was a friendly place and an egalitarian place, but still relatively formal, which is why I've never forgotten my first day at the ALS. I'd never been in a magistrate's court in my life before. The only criminal work public solicitors did in those days was indictable work, indictable trial work, and I instructed counsel. I walked into the office and the secretary, Alana Doolan, who'd been there since the office opened, greeted me. I'd met her, and said, "You've got to go to court." And I said, "Okay, Alana, where?" She said, "Newtown." I said, "Who for?" And she named a couple of brothers who became regular clients subsequently. And I said, "Well, what's it about?" And there was a slight edge in her voice when she said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Well, what are they charged with?" She said, "Look, how the fuck would I know? You're supposed to be the lawyer." But I grew to admire her enormously, Alana. She was very competent and very loyal. A young lady called Anne Weldon took over, and she was as green as grass, but gee, she learned fast. And she turned into a superb secretary and organiser and administrator. Because I think a very important part of the ALS setup, of course, was the only white person was the lawyer, the secretary and the field officer, whose role was essential, were Aboriginal and were known to the community. And that bridged the gap for people like myself who didn't know the community at all. Initially Gordon Briscoe, but not for very long. Then Sol Balier took over, Bob Balier's brother, and Sol was the field officer for the rest of my time there. We became very good mates. The field officer was always constantly by your side, particularly during conferences with clients, particularly out of the jail. I'd go out there as solicitor, but Sol would be with me. Most of the time, well, a fair bit of the time, Sol would actually know the client, and it just eased the path. Sol was a pretty important source, but not the only one. Often the ALS would just get a call from someone whose son or brother had been arrested. But even that, to a large extent, was the result of Sol's work around the area, broadcasting the good news about us and making us known. It was also itself a community centre. I mean, my waiting room, or our waiting room, was always full of people. Hardly any of them were coming to see me. They just sat in there and chatted, which was great. It was mainly local court or magistrates court appearance work, and you did it pretty much off the top of your head. I mean, you'd go in one day and you'd be told that X is in custody in Newtown or Central or up at Redfern or wherever. You'd go up and see the client. If it's a matter you can deal with on the day, you would. If you couldn't, you'd get it adjourned. Lots of them were pleas of guilty, but quite a few of them weren't. With significant pleas of not guilty that were difficult, I had ready access to counsel. In those days, we had a very big panel of solicitors and barristers who do the work pro bono. This was still in the period prior to the Whitlam government, and at this stage we had a modest grant to enable us to set up the office and pay staff, but that was it. And of course at that stage we had no country offices, we simply couldn't afford them. Setting up the country offices took a long time. I mean, the Brewarren office was being spied out when I left in February '74, but it wasn't open yet. That didn't happen until, I think, the end of that year. Insofar as there was serious crime involved, I think the police approached that much as they would with anyone else. What got up my nose and what got up the community's nose were the totally needless arrests for street offences, and that just kept happening. People were arrested for indecent language, offensive behaviour, whatever that meant. I knew cases where people were arrested for using offensive language in a public place, to wit, the public bar of the Empress Hotel, for heaven's sake. It was the Courie's pub. Of course they swore in there. We all did. But you're dead right. I mean, police did use this more or less consciously as just an ongoing control mechanism. And it was used discriminately, there's no doubt about that. They may not have seen it that way, but there's no doubt that it was. It was the blacks that were being picked up and put in vans and spending overnight in cells for a very minor offence. When I was at the ALS, a few lawyers on Friday nights would occasionally dress up in mufti and just go down to the Empress Hotel and the other hotels around the area just to observe what was happening. We didn't buy in, there was no point in doing that, but we saw what happened with our own eyes if we needed evidence. And yeah, at closing time, particularly, the trucks would turn up and quite a few people would be lumbered simply for drunkenness, which still was, formally speaking, an offence under the Summary Offences Act. Because the minute they stepped out of the hotel, there they were drunk in a public place, and in they'd go. And very often, of course, the arbitrary grab would then lead to a few words in retaliation, and then there'd be an unseemly words charge tacked on. And sometimes a bit of resistance. So drunkenness, unseemly words, and resisting police became known as the trifecta. Yeah. There was general mistrust of the police by the Couriers, and frankly, it was justified. Not of every police officer, of course. Not all of them behaved like that. But the perception was that the police were there to keep you under control, arbitrarily if necessary. So that, in a way that astounded me, because I come from such a different background, I was really dealing with the people for whom arrest was just one of life's daily hazards. You never know when it might happen, or why for that matter. It was like that. It was these street offence arrests that were the primary focus of it when it started, and Aborigines were encouraged to defend them. And some did, and some won. But of course many didn't, especially the older people, because they'd never defended a case in their lives. And to them, you know, conviction followed arrest as night follows day. And some of the older people just didn't have the stomach for it, and you can understand that. They just become inured to it. Nevertheless, some street offences were defended and defended successfully, and that must have come as something of a surprise to the police. I think they never had the experience of having to prove one of these charges. What I've said thus far paints a very dark picture of the police. I didn't intend to do that, and it wasn't always like that. I had a pretty good relationship with the Redfern detectives, who would deal with the more serious stuff, or the detectives who brought stuff to Redfern Court. In those days, Redfern Court also was the court which dealt with people from La Perouse. So police at Daysable would bring their charges to Redfern Court, and some detectives were okay, some weren't. But those who were okay, I built up a fairly good practical relationship with them. We got on quite well. We knew what our respective functions were, and we respected that. In fairness to the Redfern police, they weren't so bad. There was a division called 21 Special Squad in Regent Street. They became christened the vacuum cleaners of the streets. And they're the ones who caused most of the trouble. In that early period, before we got a substantial grant from the Whitlam government, we just couldn't handle indictable trials. I was the only solicitor, it just couldn't be done. And it was to ask country practitioners to take on indictable trials was a big ask. So we basically left that to public solicitors, to the legal aid system and the public defenders. And I'd had a background in legal aid myself. Now that worked well enough, but it didn't have the advantage of the immediate connection with the community that the ALS could offer. And that was particularly true in the country, where I think, the people doing the legal aid work in the country were competent and dedicated, but I think the community saw them as blow-ins who came in and did what they had to do and then went away. And there was no sense of identification with their community or even any understanding of its problems. In terms of respect for the ALS, that developed quite quickly. The legal profession initially wondered what on earth it was, but pretty quickly learned that it was serious and competent. The judiciary came to respect the ALS at all levels. But most importantly, I think a generation of Aboriginal people were realising they had rights which they could enforce, and they had a source to go to help them do it. There was a remarkable woman called Shirley Smith. You've no doubt heard about her. And there was also a remarkable priest at St Vincent Redfern called Ted Kennedy, who's now dead. Shirley and Ted worked closely together, just looking after homeless Kooris who were drinking too much and ending up on the streets. Shirley, of course, was truly amazing. I mean, Shirley regularly visited jails, kept contact with Aboriginal prisoners, and to her it was never in any sense a charity or a duty. She did it because she loved those people. It's as simple as that. She could never have done otherwise. And she was often in court with me, just supporting Aboriginal people, sometimes in quite serious cases, but often in the run-of-the-mill cases. So there was that deep sort of loving community involvement that was with us as well.